The heart is the capital of the mind. The mind is a single state. The heart and the mind together make a single continent. One is the population, numerous enough. This ecstatic nation seek it is yourself. That is a poem by an American poet named Emily Dickinson. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she's a very important poet in English literature. And she lived in the 19th century, and she had a very amazing viewpoint of the world. And the values represented in that poem are quite important. Because one thing about creativity is, this title is really heavy. I'm sorry about that. But I'm talking about the way life really is, that's where we have to start, n'est-ce pas? And so, and this is what I'm going to say next is very heavy too. But I hope it'll get lighter as it goes on, okay? Because creativity, you have to remember one very important thing, is that human beings have always been creative. One of the most incredible examples happened in the 20th century with the Holocaust, because the Nazi regime invented an incredible way of killing people very rapidly. And it took a lot of imagination to do that. A lot of creativity to do it. Creativity, huh? If what we're dealing with creativity is that if the values that are the underpinning of that creativity are extremely important, so that we can't just use our imaginations and say we're creative. We have to know what we're doing and why we're doing it and for whom we're doing it. Creativity doesn't mean anything unless we have, it depends on the values that we're supporting with the creativity. And now, talking music is something that, it touches many, many people. There's hardly anybody in the world, one human being, I don't know anyone that doesn't like music. I must say. And it's not just because I'm a musician that I say that, it's just one of those things, everybody likes music. So, and it's also a very important thing about crossover, because in music, crossover has been going on for centuries and centuries. But also, crossover has been going on between human beings for centuries and centuries and centuries. This so-called, I have to refer to Adolf Hitler again, but this so-called pure race will never exist. It can't. There's no way that it will ever exist. So people have been crossing over for millennium, maybe, huh? But in music, it's become it's an important thing, because with the way this whole structure of economic structure has been existing since the Second World War, with our categories, making everything into categories. At one point, it was clear that the musicians were not going to be able to be stuck into different categories, and we actually had what we called, and I think this was the end of the 70s, where we had what we called crossover music. And that was the first thing where we would get pop rock, or we got jazz rock, which was one of the first, actually, jazz rock, which I don't remember, though, you know those groups, Chicago and Blood, Sweat and Tears. That was at the end of the 70s. So music is an interesting point in that it wanted to get out of the boxes. People were very intent on it. And there's a good reason for that, because the human imagination never really works that way. We like to put it into boxes. These boxes are very good for selling things, but they're not necessarily good for the way the human mind thinks, how it works. I remember when I was a kid, I was brought up in Arizona and Southern California, and this was a long time ago, ladies and gentlemen. It was in the early 50s, and we would go out to a record store, and there was just records, and they just had records. They didn't have this music and that music and this music and that music, and they just had records. And you'd go and you wanted to get Chopin, so you'd go and say, can I get a record of Chopin? Well, yeah, we have. Or I wanted to get Hank Williams. Hank Williams, you know Hank Williams, of course. Yeah, there's one person that does. Hank Williams is really one of the great sort of what we call now country western singers. But he was just a down-home Louisiana guy. But it ended up being country western, so we did use to ask for Hank Williams. And this brings me to the beginning of this thing. The most important part of this is like this eclecticism is what we're talking about in crossover. Eclecticism. It's the mixing of different styles because of the fact that people communicate with one another. It's not necessarily going to, I don't know, like in world music now. I remember this young French guy saying, well, our music in France, it just doesn't swing. So I'm going to go to Africa. And he went to Mali, where the music really swings. And he got these African guys to come play in his band, so his music would swing. That isn't really what we're talking about in this eclecticism. The eclecticism is about communicating, dialogue, and keeping and helping cultural identity stay alive. Because without cultural identity, we don't exist any longer. So eclecticism is a sort of a natural crossbreeding between people. And that's what crossover is, in my opinion. But I have to, after this, I'm going to say that I'd like to explain to you how this uncrossover happened when this world in perpetual crisis. It probably has always been in perpetual crisis, the world, probably. Now, where we're living now, it's come to a breaking point. The tools that we used for 5,000 years, between 12,000 years, I don't know, since we became settled down and we started agriculture and so on and so forth, the tools that we needed to survive were based on hierarchical architectures, structures, with the boss at the top and the people under him like this, and then the rest of us on the bottom. We are always trying, and the role of the boss was to find the guy that was the most gifted for doing the right job. So you don't want a guy who doesn't know how to hunt to go out and hunt. You want the guy who knows how to hunt to go on. The guy who is a hunter is not necessarily a good fisherman. So you get the guy who's a good fisherman to go fishing, you get the guy, and we've been doing this for a long time. These structures have been made like this, with someone at the top and working our way down to where the rest of the people are. And the tools that were created to support these systems are now beginning to work against us. And that is a problem, and that's where we need creativity. You understand? And where the idea of crossover becomes interesting, because it can help us stimulate our imaginations and to find new tools to structure our lives. It's happening slowly. Even 6 or 7 years ago, you didn't have these kinds of things, this little morning things like this. It's very, very, very nice, and there's all kinds of these different things happening to try to get ourselves, our imaginations, out of these hierarchical structures. Now the hierarchical structures, and I hope there are some managers and bosses in here, leaders are necessary. But a leader is not necessarily someone who runs the show and stays up on top and tells everybody what to do. That does not work anymore. It hasn't been working at all. And it's now it's one of those tools that is working against us. In 1968, everything went boom. And because of the Vietnam War and the realization of the American people that they were doing something wrong, that the people I'm talking about, the bosses, they were doing what they thought was right, but the people thought that it was wrong. And finally, whoosh, it all exploded, and we didn't stop the war, because they stopped the war when they wanted to stop the war, but we made a lot of racket and a lot of noise. And it also changed a bit the consciousness of people. And at that time I started thinking about, being a musician, and so I started noticing something very interesting, that there was I'm a composer, and I was very interested in contemporary music. Pierre Boulez, you know who he is? I worked with Luciano Berio, do you know who he is? An Italian composer. Boulez, we produced concerts, and I was the manager of the concert series, and then I noticed that even people who had the same educational background as someone like Pierre Boulez or like me could not get into that music. I loved Pierre Boulez for a certain couple of years there. I must say, not any longer, but for a few years I was very, very attracted to that music, but I was a complete specialist in the whole, he's gonna change me. I'm changed. I might be able to come back. But I noticed that people of the same educational level, so-called, as I was, could not get into this music. I could get into it because I knew so much about music, but somebody else, like a psychologist or a doctor in medicine or something like that, couldn't. He said, I don't know. And he was more interested in the Beatles. So I started to ask myself these questions, and so I finally, after investigating, I found out that there is what we call musique savant, and then there is what we call popular music. And the musique savant is music for a small elite group of people, and the popular music is for the so-called masses. And this is also something that's been going on in Western culture since about the middle of the Middle Ages, which is about the year 1000, where the musique savant comes from the sacred music, and the popular music, which we have no recordings of, record of, because they didn't make scores, but it was the guys playing in the saloons and stuff like that, and for the parties. And so there was the music for thinking, and there's the music for having a party. And so this line has been going on for quite a long time. So this has been going on for a long time, and after World War II, when the Americans won the war, yeah, I know everybody's happy about that. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like if the Nazis had won. But on the other hand, the Americans are really good businessmen, aren't they? That's one of the things we do best. We do good music, and some visual arts, and business. But business we're really good at. And so what happened with World War II, when we won the war, is that when we went all over the world and we imposed this economic system that we had invented at our house, as they say in French, it was imposed. So at that point, we got the supermarkets, we got the highways, we got, a lot of cars, more and more cars. Kept the machine going, no matter what it costs, keep that machine going, because with the hierarchical structure, the guys, they were doing great, And of course, I think the whole, maybe we could say that the whole standard of living for everyone had risen somewhat, because we got refrigerators in Europe, and we got television, 10 years after us, of course. But television, we all know what it does. And so what happened is that after the Second World War, the people who were the composers and the guys who were creating music, and I had talked to them, Henri Pousseur, Berlioz, and all these other guys, and it was very important for them to do something that would not retrace the steps that the whole music world had done just up to there. So even like Johannes Brahms, which is, you know who Johannes Brahms is, I hope, and so even his music, which is musique savant, has a way of touching people. He's trying to communicate with people all the time with his music. But this, what we call the post-serial school of music, which was Boulez, Stockhausen, Berlioz, Pousseur, Karel Goeyvaerts, also, which he abandoned it actually. You know who Karel Goeyvaerts is? The Flemish composer, no? And then, but they all decided that they would just pull themselves out, and they didn't want to communicate with people. It wasn't important. And of course, so that meant that all this kind of music this sort of disappeared, like Brahms and stuff. So there's a couple of exceptions, like somebody like Francis Poulenc. I don't know if you know him either, but he makes music that is kind of like, you know, everybody can get into, and Darius Milhaud also. But they weren't considered to be really good composers either. So then, of course, there was also George Gershwin, and there's also, but he's not considered to be a composer at all. He wrote songs, but he's a great composer. But so this whole part of the efforts of composers and creative musicians was pulled away from the public, which left a huge place for the American business to come in and take over, which means the popular music took up the space that was left. Are you following me there? Yeah? This situation came from the need to sell things. So, like in the early 50s, when I was going to the record store with my father, and we'd go ask, where's I don't know. And so Chopin, he give us a Chopin. So that stopped, and we started putting music, selling music like you sell vegetables. You know, you don't put the potatoes with the onions, and you certainly don't put the bread and the tomatoes together. You put the bread here and the tomatoes there and the potatoes here and that, and then people can find them easier, and they can. But that meant to sell the music, which was the most important thing to this American business situation. We started having what we call the music industry. And we still have the music industry. And the thing is, it's getting rough out there. Britney Spears, she's a pretty girl and everything like that, but, and she dances okay. And got a sort of a nice voice. But Beyonce has a great voice, you know, she's really a good singer. But they're just out, it's just, excuse me ladies and gentlemen, but they're tits and ass, you know, like the chorus line of the show, and that's what it is, that's how it works. So the whole thing became the commercial music and this other kinds of music. Jazz became a music salon. Charlie Parker, of course, the bebop was part of the revolution of the African Americans to really show white people that they had something, that we have something you don't have. And it was very hard for a white guy to get into the bebop circles. It was impossible, actually. There were a couple of cases, and I never really figured out how it happened, you know, like Lee Konitz and Haig, the piano player, and so on. But there are very few. So all this other music, even there's some of now even some of the really like the blues players, like certain kinds of very pure, I'm talking about American music, I'm talking like bluegrass and something like this. It's become sort of a music which is normally popular, but it has become sort of included in this very small percentage of the market, which is, and then what also happened is, you know, I've been living in Wallonia for 34 years actually now, and I'm sure it's probably the same thing in Flanders probably as well, and Holland and Germany. Every little place had their music. There was the music wallonne, and I'm sure that there's Flemish music, and they might be very close to one another, but they're different. And that cultural identity that they gave, what they gave to the cultural identity, wait a minute, maybe you've got it already. what they did in creating, they gave something to the cultural identity of each locality. I had gone, there's this country called Bhutan. You know where the Bhutan? I don't know how to say it in English actually. Bhutan? Bhutan? I don't know. It's in the Himalayas, at the foot of the Himalayas. They have what they call not the gross national product, but the gross happiness index. To see, they want to know if the government is making everybody happy. And they have these different sociological studies that they go through, and they ask questions to people, and they go and they ask people questions. And one of the most important things is that sense of cultural identity is what makes people happy. And this is in a small country. I think there's only 500,000 people living in this country, something less than 1 million anyway. And there's little villages all over, and they all speak the same language, but every village has its own song, and that is our song. And it's not about an our song to say, your song's no good, and my song is great. It's just that it's our song. And we sing it, we've been singing it like that forever and ever, and that's the way it is. And they have theirs, and we have ours. And that has disappeared from the cultural structure of the planet now. It's disappearing. Well, I don't think it's completely disappeared. I hope not. But that's a place where we have to start to keep those cultural identities. And so facing all this stuff, I said, well, what in the world can I do as a human being and a musician? What can I do? And I said, well, first thing I have to try to do myself is try to make a music that doesn't belong to either savant or popular, but comes from a deep desire from myself to communicate with people. This doesn't mean that I have to have sold 500 million copies of a CD. It doesn't mean that I have to have a name that is a household word like Beyoncé or something like that. It means that I have to want myself deeply communicate with people with my music. And so that's what I started trying to do. This was in the beginning of the 80s, I guess, when I finally hit. Oh yeah, time already, my God. Well, I'm almost done anyway, so. What time is it?
20.
Oh yeah, oh. So, then the other thing is, I said, well, to keep the cultural identity, I'm an Occidental person, I'm a Western man. I'm an American, but I'm a Western man, like we are all Western. And one of the most important things that we have done in music was the notion of a big ensemble. In Bali, for example, they have orchestras of 18 people. They have the big band of jazz, but the real big orchestra that doesn't exist anywhere but in the West. And it's an amazing thing. It has been abused by all kinds of things, and what I'm trying to do with this orchestra is to create a new way of collaborating with people, musicians collaborating together. So we don't have a chef d'orchestre, we don't have, we are rehearsing, there are 3 of us do most of the rehearsing, me and 2 young colleagues. We lead the rehearsals, but at that point it stimulates the discussion, so it's sometimes this joyous, chaotic, how do we say it again? Joyous, chaotic anarchy, and it just noise and people talking and they're discussing, and we just let it go, and then finally it starts to calm down, and when everybody gets everything done, we get back to the unison. And it's very, very beautiful. And it's a way of, we're trying to, how do you say it, take away these hierarchical structures and to make a flat structure where I'm the artistic director, but I have no veto power. If I can't convince them that what I tell them is right, and they say, no, Garrett, we don't want to do it that way. Okay, I say, okay, well, let's do it your way then, and we do it their way, and if it works, it's fantastic. If it doesn't work, fantastic. Because, you know, when you break your nose a little bit, you learn a lot of things, don't you? So it's important to be able to make mistakes. You all know that. That's one of the new things that's come up these last few years. I hope you all know that making mistakes is absolutely necessary. And so we'll never find our real direction until we do. So we made this orchestra vivo, and it's a classical orchestra. We've tried all kinds of different seating arrangements. Finally, we came back to the classical way of doing it with the violins and the cellos in front and the winds in back and everything because it works. That's the best sound. That's the way that you know, why screw up something if it works? Don't fix it if it ain't. No, what's that saying again? That's right. Don't fix it if it ain't broke. But the other thing is that all the music we play comes from the people who are inside the ensemble. So the compositions are made by composers who are also players. And then from there, people can participate in the creation of the work. And finally, we can even ask the composer, well, can we get rid of that thing there? Is it okay? Yes, I got the message, kids. I'm almost done. So we got it. So we even change the composer's wishes, and so we're really trying to get that flat structure out of vivo. And I think there's an example of something. You have a video, I think.